A long time ago, we figured out how we can use fire to get light and heat. And a bit later, we figured out that heat is just a form of motion and we can use it to get out motion again. And later still, we figured out what electricity is and how we can get electricity from motion. And that's how our civilization works in a nutshell. We burn stuff for heat, we use heat for motion, and we use motion to get electricity. And that's how we run things now, and we spend billions each year buying stuff with the express intent of just burning it. So today I want to talk about one of those things we burn, gas. Natural gas and how we transport it. What is natural gas? Now, the most common natural gas for industrial use are the so-called alkanes, which are hydrocarbons of the specific form of CnH2n+2. And usually this is a mixture of methane, ethane and propane. The most straightforward use for gas is of course burn it for heat, and you can do it either directly in homes or centrally in a heating plant. And cooking with gas is just a slight variation of this, really. Another important application is electricity generation. In essence, you burn gas in boilers or gas turbines and you use the heat to vaporize water. This vapor is used to power steam turbines, and the steam turbines generate electricity. And actually, this is how any power plant works at the most basic level. You produce steam to power a turbine, and the only difference with power plants is really how the steam is produced. And in this sense, even a nuclear power plant is just a fancy way to boil water. A special feature of gas-powered plants is their so-called peaking capabilities, which means that they can be powered on or off within minutes. This means that they're often used to complement other types of power plants, because, for example, coal or nuclear are too inflexible, and the renewables like solar and wind have too much variance. Thirdly, and not many people know this, but gas is also a raw material. It's a feedstock for many chemical substances. It's used to produce plastics, solvents, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers, this is a really big one, different fuels, etc., etc., etc. And generally, the biggest pros of gas are that it produces less pollution, including CO2 when it's burned. And also it has a higher combustion efficiency because you can burn it at higher temperatures. The main drawback is that gas is a gas, so it has a really low density, and this means it also has a really low energy density. And this means that both storage of gas and even more transport of gas are key issues that you kind of have to solve somehow. LNG, liquefying natural gas. We already mentioned the huge difference in energy density between gas and other fossil fuels. And this difference was a factor of 1,000. And this means that for every single oil tanker you send somewhere, you would have to send 1,000 gas tankers there. So clearly that's not an option. The cheapest and most straightforward way to transport gas is a network of pipelines. There is of course a high initial cost for building the pipeline network, but the running cost once it's established is very moderate. The technology is robust and highly scalable. So there are several networks in the world that are thousands of kilometers long. There is another way though, and its importance has been rising over the last couple decades and the last year especially. If you cool down the natural gas to a temperature of -160 degrees, you will achieve two things. First, this means the gas will be liquefied, and second, this means its density will go up by a factor of 600. And this whole process is called liquefied natural gas, or LNG in short. Now we're talking. This liquefaction of the gas is essentially just a regular refrigeration process that's also used in fridges or freezers or air conditioning, etc. And here's the thing. While it's not really complicated, it's also not trivial. And if you really want to explain it in detail, you'll have to go into quite a number of additional concepts like latent heat or vapor saturation or phase changes, and this would simply take too long. So in the end, I decided to keep it really simple for this video and do an in-depth explanation of refrigeration in a future video. Now, this is the basic makeup of the refrigeration cycle. It uses a synthetic fluid called the refrigerant or the coolant, which is flowing in a closed loop. Let's start at this point. The liquid coolant moves through the expander where the pressure is reduced and the coolant is partially vaporized again. Next, at the evaporator, the coolant comes into contact with the fluid it is supposed to cool, like the air in your fridge or the natural gas in the liquefaction plant, and it takes on heat from this fluid, completely vaporizing in the process. Now the vaporized coolant moves on to the compressor. The role of the compressor is to increase the pressure on the coolant and with it its temperature, and it requires energy input to function, usually in the form of electricity. Finally, the hot vapor enters the condenser and sheds heat to the outside environment. And it's also condensating in the process, meaning it becomes liquid again. If you've ever seen the back of a fridge, it's this wild array of tubes and their purpose is to heat up the air in the kitchen. So, in the most basic terms, you use electricity to move heat from an enclosed space to the outside environment. The complete LNG life cycle. The entire life cycle of LNG looks something like this. Directly after extraction, the gas is usually contaminated with dust, acidic gases like hydrogen sulfide or CO2, water and mercury. All of those need to be removed in pre-treatment to prevent corrosion in the pipelines and also problems later in the liquefaction. The gas is then inducted into a pipeline and moved to the liquefaction plant, where it is cooled down as explained before. Of course, the actual industrial processes are more complicated than the simple model we used in our explanation. There are different processes using different coolants, or the process is run in iterative cycles, etc. The liquefied gas is then loaded into specially designed ships with insulated cargo holds that keep the gas at temperature. At the receiving terminal, the LNG is regasified simply by heating it again. The energy for regasification and liquefaction is provided by a portion of the gas that is sidelined for this, which is called the burn-off gas. Finally, the gas is transported to the consumer by pipeline again. Why LNG and other last questions? Why LNG? If pipelines are the better solution, why is LNG even a thing in the first place? Well, it's not always possible or at least feasible to construct a pipeline, for example, from the Middle East all the way to Japan or from the US to Europe. So there are a number of cases where the only realistic option is shipping it, and the only realistic option for shipping it is LNG. Is the technology new? Not really, it's almost 100 years old by now. LNG is an example of a technology that already existed, but it had to wait for a long time to be economically viable. Is LNG the future? Well, obviously it's a fossil fuel and all of those have the same problems. They are a limited resource and they contribute a lot to pollution, especially CO2 pollution. So at best, LNG is a stopgap solution until we have a better technology. Having said that, gas is decidedly better in almost all respects than all the other fossil fuels. So